We'll go. Okay, evening everyone. We will kick off. People that are on. As I was just saying before everyone come on, we have got to the stage where we get a lot of people watch the recording, and I've had a few people indicate that. So yeah, it's really good. So that is a warning that's being recorded, but it will be available as soon as possible on YouTube for people to watch or re-watch, whatever it might be. Had a few apologies. I just noticed one from Mel Nicholas, one of our management committee. Hopefully the rest of them are on. We had a fairly long meeting last night, so it was still good. Now, tonight is being brought to us courtesy of the Agriculture Victoria and Victorian Government's Southwest Victoria Drought Support Events Program 2025. I've got Tess McDougall mentioned it to me a few weeks ago, and I said, yeah, well, the best thing I reckon we can do is to get people like Jess and Cam and Grace on and give us a bit of an update of what we should be doing and what might be ahead of us with Jess, and then a few more positive bits for when the weather does break. And I'm going to hand over to Sinead, who is our new PPS project manager, 3 weeks into the job, and yeah, killing them. So yeah, I'll hand over to Sinead. For those who are worried about me, which is probably nobody, but I'm still on for another two and a bit months, and then we'll be taking a lesser role as a plan at this stage, unless they realise Sinead is so good that they can get rid of me altogether. But hopefully that's not the case. So I'll hand over to Sinead and welcome everyone.
Hi everyone, welcome to tonight. Hopefully we'll get some good information about what we can do managing the current autumn conditions we're about to face. First off tonight we'll be hearing from Jess about some of our feeding options, and then we'll hear from Grace and Cam from Gorst. So yeah, I'd like to invite Jess to have a chat with us. Thanks, Jess.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob and Sinead. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for tuning in on your Tuesday night. To hear about autumn feed strategies. So a very challenging season at the moment. I'll just check you can see my slides. Yes, excellent. If I don't know you, my name is Jess Revell, and I run a business called Rumenate Livestock Services, which provides independent livestock nutrition and animal production advice to dairy, beef, and sheep producers across southern Australia. And I'm based at a little place called Burrumbeet near Ballarat. So tonight I've been asked to talk to you about autumn feed strategies, and to start that off, we're going to look at some local feed quality. So the PPS team have continued their feed quality project. They started testing pastures last year around October, and that finished up in January when the results were fairly consistent, and the quality decline meant that that didn't continue from then on. So we'll have a look at some of the pasture species in that, and we've got some local supplementary feed, which I'm going to talk about because quality seems to be good this year with the finish that we've had. We'll look at livestock requirements for March. So where are you at in terms of breeding ewes, and what do they require, depending on when you put rams out. Requirements for cattle, especially for calving at the moment, and for weaners, depending on what sort of growth rate you're trying to achieve. We'll look at effective supplementation. So I'm just going to talk around some of the deficiencies I'm seeing in rations, and just some general diets. If you are feeding a grain and cereal hay-based diet or a heap of supplementation, what that might look like depending on your stage of pregnancy. And then we're going to look at the transition to green feed, whenever that may be, and how we manage some of the issues we commonly see out of a dry season, and how we manage that transition well onto that, hopefully, flush of pasture, or now that may have built that nice pasture wedge coming into winter, fingers crossed. So if I just talk around a seasonal update and what I'm seeing when I'm out in the paddock at the moment, while I hear there were some downpours or some patchy downpours around the region last week, which may have even caused some flooding in some places. It is pretty dry across the board. So seeing a heap of ewes still in containment or being fed on sacrifice paddocks and getting 100% supplementary feed. As I go around the district and look at those rations, they were great early on, but certainly if you'd put rams out December, January, those pregnancy requirements are starting to increase, especially if you put them out in December. And it's probably a public service announcement now to really check those rations and make sure that they're meeting the nutritional requirements of that ewe and the fetus that will start to significantly increase in growth and have a drain of energy on that ewe. So I'm starting to see some of that body condition score fall in ewes that have been in containment for a period of time, especially if we haven't readjusted rations for their pregnancy cycle. And that's going to have an impact on how that fetus grows, but how that ewe manages those later stages of pregnancy and increases the risk of some of those common metabolic diseases, such as pregnancy toxemia. So if we've put ewes into containment and they weren't in body condition score 3, which is our target, or 3.5, and they may have dropped since they've been in containment, then that's going to have an impact on their fertility status. So as we get that drop in ewe condition score, we start to see fertility and twinning decrease. So we see there, the red line is our twin ewes. If they've got the genetic potential to produce twins, and they're reducing in body condition score, chances are they'll produce a single lamb or may even be a dry ewe if we're not targeting that body condition score. So I'm seeing a lot of variation in body condition of ewes in containment that have been there for a long period of time. So really important to get them in and start checking their body condition score status and redrafting the pens potentially based on body condition score, especially if you're in those early stages of pregnancy, so we're not having an impact on that fetus if they have conceived a lamb. The other thing I've seen is there's a lot of lambs being finished in containment at the moment, or again on smaller sacrifice paddocks and getting 100% of their diet. Weight gains have been variable, but generally across the board, they've been really good. Rations have been balanced well. But the thing I have noticed is that lighter lambs have gone into these confinement systems a lot earlier. So where typically we would put lambs in sort of at that minimum 35 kilos of live weight, because there's been not much feed in the paddock or nothing in the paddock, they've gone in at a lot lighter live weight. So lambs that may have been weaned in there or may have been sort of that 27 to 30 kilos have spent quite a while in containment, and really important that if they are under that 35 kilos, that you've designed their rations around a higher protein diet until they get to that 35 kilos, then readjusting that ration to account for that more energy dense ration to really drive your growth rates. But overall, the quality of lambs coming out of feedlots at the moment is really good, and there's money in feedlotting now with the current lamb market. On the cattle side, for those of you that are cattle producers, obviously autumn calving right now, and I'm seeing sort of a 50-50% split. Cow condition either seems to be really good or they've gone into calving with a loss of body condition. So they've really struggled in that last 2 months prior to calving, which has meant they've lost body condition. And now with that energy demand for milk production, that's really drawn body condition off those cows. Really important to feed them to meet their energy requirement now, because once it comes in cold, they're going to lose body condition significantly at a faster rate, and it's going to be a lot harder to feed them over the winter than to put body condition score on them now. So they'll peak after they calve, they'll peak in milk production around 6 to 8 weeks after calving, which is their highest energy demand. And then after that time, it's easier to put body condition on those cows. So really important if you are in that situation to be really meeting their energy requirements. If you're not, they're going to drop in milk production, which means the calf is going to get less milk and won't be thriving in terms of average daily gain. But really important to get condition on them over the autumn so they go into winter with a fat store. A lot of you have early weaned, seeing a lot of weaners on supplementary feed. Their growth rates seem to be going really well. Diets have been balanced for their average daily gain or a steady average daily gain, sort of seeing that 0.5 to 0.7 kilos minimum target. And overall condition of those weaners seems to be going quite well out in the paddock. The issue with those is that as they get heavier, their energy density will increase, and we need to balance our rations to reduce that protein component for them to keep them growing, depending on what sort of target market you are targeting. The other thing that I'm seeing across the board is obviously the cost of protein is high, but there's a lack of protein on the market as well. So really hard to find lupins and beans. Most of our vetches and lucins are either very highly priced or they're not available. So seeing a lot of diets that are lacking protein at the moment, especially for use in those later stages of pregnancy that may be still on a urea lick in containment and are starting to need that higher protein diet to build muscle on that fetus or support their pregnancy protein requirement, getting ready for lambing or those later stages of pregnancy. So we're seeing a lot of these manure scores where they look like pellets, or in cattle, they're built up like towers. You can visually see the fiber in them because we've got poor rumen function. We're feeding them a lot of energy, but we've got no or minimal rumen bug growth to be able to utilize those energy sources. And we're seeing that visually in their manure score. So again, checking diets that you are meeting their protein requirement. The rumen bugs grow on protein. If we're not adding additional protein to the diet or our forages aren't high enough in protein, we're getting poor rumen function, and we're visually seeing this in the paddock. The other issue has been really poor water quality. So obviously, and mostly due to dam supply as well, and bores seizing because of the poor water supply, or obviously being a dry year, issues with water supply. But that has caused a lot of issues with water quality. So I've seen a heap of algal bloom issues and a lot of E. coli and salmonella issues, especially if you're relying on dam water. You've got stock walking through that water as supply drops. They're obviously increasing contamination with fecal matter, leading to these E. coli issues and salmonella issues. The other thing has been in containment or in feedlots, where we're getting that poor water quality come through those containment facilities and getting a lot of poor weight gains and death in mature animals, but also in lambs, more so than cattle, due to that bacterial load. So really important that if you are having issues with water quality, that we try and correct those early, because it has a huge impact on production. So we see on the left of the slide the recommended salt levels for stock. So if we look at mature sheep, 6,000 parts or less, ideally. For lambs, less than 3,800. For cattle, mature cattle, less than 4,000 parts per million is our target. When we look at bacteria, we can easily get that tested through any of our feed testing companies or Eurofins in Melbourne. Ideally, we're looking for that E. coli load of less than 1,000 colony forming units per 100 mils to be safe for livestock. Where we've got algal blooms, there's various ways to correct those. Obviously, we can add additives into our dams to try and treat that algal bloom, obviously get it aerated. I've had some people add barley straw to their dams to try and break that algal bloom down. Various ways to try and minimize that, but has been a huge issue in the area. Just on water testing, the way that I like to test is just to get a plastic bottle, like a 600 ml drink bottle, fill that bottle with the water that you're testing, and then send it away to your water testing company early in the week. Ideally to get a good E. coli and salmonella reading. You don't want it sitting in the post over the weekend. So if you can send those on a Monday or Tuesday, and then get those samples back, it'll give you a better idea of the bacterial load in those water samples. Just having a look at local feed quality. So Rob and the PPS team did a heap of feed quality samples again this year, following on from that feed quality project. And that stopped around January. They don't tend to feed test, as the feed tests that come back are fairly consistent in that decline in quality. So that ended at the start of January. So this was just some examples from various regions around the area on the dry pasture feed tests. And most of these feed tests come back sort of at the end of December. So we have a look there. The Chalicum View mix, 89% dry matter, so really dry feed at the end of December. Protein levels throughout those different feed tests, again, were really low. May have supported maintenance if the animal could eat enough. But we look at over on the fourth column, and the NDF levels are really high, which we see in that drop in feed intake. So they couldn't really eat enough to support their requirements towards the end of December when that pasture did go dry. So we've got crude protein. Ideally, a use requirement for maintenance is 8 to 10% protein, but that is 80 to 100 grams per kilo that she's eating of protein. So if she can't eat a kilo, then obviously that protein level is a lot lower, and she wouldn't have been meeting her requirements towards the end of December. Digestibility is really low. We start to see livestock lose weight at 55% and below digestibility. So we see that significant drop off at the end of December. Really high NDF. We would expect a straw to be between 70 and 75% NDF, which is considered high and limits intake. Our pastures were definitely meeting that target towards the end of December. So couldn't physically eat enough to support their requirements, and really low energy levels during that time. So 6s and 7 megajoules of energy. You'll see there it says Chalicum View Mix and Chalicum View Select. Select means Rob got down on his hands and knees and pretended to be a sheep and selectively grazed that pasture, or selectively picked up what he thought a ewe might eat in that paddock. So as he selectively grazed, you see the quality is slightly better than if he took a sample of that whole mix of dry feed. So some really interesting data. Rob also tested lucens and vetches. They still tested really high coming into January. So they were over 25% crude protein, really high digestibility, low NDF, and really good energy levels between 10 and 11 megajoules. So those legume varieties still really hitting our targets, especially for weaners over the summer, if you had those available in the paddock. He also tested some clover seed and clover burr. So there was not much in the paddock. He scratched around and got that seed or that flour and sent that away to be tested. And that come back at 12.5 megajoules of energy and 16% protein. So we see sheep scratching around the paddock, especially weaners. They're picking up that flour head, and they're still receiving quite a good diet if it's there in an ample amount. So for that to come back at 16% when it doesn't look like there's much in the paddock is a really good result. Just having a look at some local feed quality and the supplements that were harvested in the local area and how they tested. Overall, I'm seeing an increase in crude protein and metabolizable energy of that supplementary feed, especially on cereal hays and straws, with the frosty finish in most cases that we had at harvest. So the way the season finished meant that the quality of those cereal hays and straws was a lot better that had been cut for hay and straw. With that increase in metabolizable energy and crude protein, there's been a huge increase in water-soluble carbohydrates, which is the sugar component, which means even for straw, if you had it tested, sheep are licking it up, especially because it is like lollies to them with the finish that we had. And a decrease in NDF. So typically with higher quality comes lower fiber levels, which they can tend to eat more of that cereal hay or straw that had been made at the end of harvest last year. So that means if our livestock are in containment, that we're actually feeding less if you've had it feed tested and it's testing like this, because we're feeding a better quality diet and less of it. So to look at some local feed quality, there's a few different tests that Rob took. So cereal hay at Chalicum View, 87.6% dry matter, 8.7% crude protein, 10.2 megs of energy, which is fantastic, and under 50% NDF. So we would expect straw, as I said before, to be 70 to 75% NDF. This cereal hay really means that we can drive feed intakes because it is so low, and water-soluble carbohydrates or sugars extremely high this year. So typically we'd see cereal hay sort of test around 15 to 19% on average in the area. This year they're testing over 20% sugars, which means it's very tasty lollies for our livestock. Compare that to the year before and slightly lower values. So 8s and 9s. On average for the area, we see typically crude protein of 8 and an energy value of 8 and higher NDFs across the board, lower sugars. Barley straw coming out of Mount Dryden, 90% dry matter, crude protein of 2, just under 50% digestibility, higher energy across the board for straw this year, 6.7 megajoules of energy per kilo, and water-soluble carbohydrates around 4. And then a 30% arrow leaf clover and an annual mix for hay, tested around 13% protein, 9.6 megas of energy, and a really low NDF. So where we've got that legume influence in that hay really pushes up that crude protein value and decreases our fiber level so they can eat more depending on the time of cut. So some really good values coming out of the local area. Aside from the feed testing project, this is just some stuff that I've tested. So again, cereal hays, we see that really high sugar level, nearly 20% sugars, reasonable megajoules of energy, and good levels of crude protein for a cereal hay. And then again, barley straw, 8 megajoules of energy in this case. And I've really tested between 6 and 10 megajoules of energy for straw this year, which we don't normally get. Usually an average would be 5 megajoules. Quite a high NDF in this scenario, but really high sugars for straw on average. So ideally you would expect cereal hay to be up around that 20% this year or plus. But barley straw is also testing quite well compared to previous seasons, which means hopefully if we have had our supplementary feeds tested, or if you haven't, would be wise to do so, because chances are we can feed less if those nutrient values are higher to meet our livestock requirements. And then just to look at some cereal grains. So we've got barley from 2023 there. Barley, the protein we really only see as a nutritionist change the most. Typically, we would put that into rations around 12% and 12.5 megas of energy, a little bit lower in 2023. Red wheat coming out of Mount Dryden this year, around 14% protein and 13.9 megas of energy, 64% starch. So some really good results on cereal grains that were able to be harvested from the area. So moving on to livestock requirements, and I've just taken a range of ewes across the board and their standard reference weight. So we're going to look at a 50 kilo ewe, a 60 kilo ewe, and a 70 kilo ewe to see where you're at depending on when you put your rams out. So if we put our rams out around the 1st of December or in December, a 50 kilo ewe right now for March, if she joined in that first cycle, should be around 107 days pregnant. So she's coming into that pointy end of her pregnancy cycle, that last 6 weeks, where we're going to get 70% of that fetal growth occurring and her energy requirements starting to significantly increase. So if you're in this system, really important that you start checking rations to make sure you're meeting her requirements so we don't get some of those issues with pregnancy toxemia that we commonly see when we're not feeding enough energy during this time. Her energy requirements are going to change nearly every 10 days because of that fetal requirement. So really important to check those rations regularly. So if we've got a 50 kilo, let's say merino ewe, she requires 11.2 megajoules of energy, and her protein requirements are starting to increase to support that fetal growth and milk production. So we want to target our rations, if we haven't already, to be targeting around that 12% crude protein. A 60 kilo ewe requires around 13.4 megs of energy. Again, she's going to eat a little bit more, so she requires 12% crude protein, but remember that's 120 grams per kilo. So she requires a little bit more protein than our 50 kilo ewe because she eats more, and the same with our 70 kilo ewe. So our 70 kilo ewe, let's say a composite ewe, requires 14.6 megajoules of energy to support her 107 or 110 day megajoule requirement or pregnancy requirement. And again, we need a little bit higher protein diet because she's eating more to support that fetal growth and milk production. For those of you that joined on the 1st of Jan or in January, if that ewe conceived in that first cycle, she's around 76 days pregnant. So a 50 kilo ewe, standard reference weight, body condition score 3, requires around 9.3 megs of energy and a little bit lower protein at 10% crude protein. A 60 kilo ewe, 11.2 megajoules of energy, and a 70 kilo ewe, 12 megajoules of energy. If we joined on the 1st of Feb, our 50 kilo ewe requires 8.5 megajoules of energy. If she joined in that first cycle, she's around 45, 50 days pregnant. A 60 kilo ewe requires 10.2 megas of energy, and our 70 kilo ewe requires 11 megajoules of energy. So really important to meet those energy requirements, but also be aware of the overall crude protein percentage of your diet. If we're not meeting that, we're getting poor rumen function, and that you can't physically meet her requirements without that rumen microbe growth. And then just to finish off, if we joined on the 1st of March and she joined in that first cycle, she should be around 17 days pregnant. And this is really maintenance requirement. So 8.4 megs of energy for a 50 kilo ewe, 10 megs for a 60 kilo ewe, and 10.9 megs for a 70 kilo ewe. So there's just some targets. All of those targets are available on the Lifetime Ewe Management website or AWI website. Look at your pregnancy cycle, work out the days of pregnancy if they joined in that first pregnancy cycle, and just readjust your rations to support those requirements. If we need to put on half a body condition score, depending on the standard reference weight of your ewe, she needs a minimum of 6 megajoules above maintenance to meet that half a kilo or that half body condition score excess for energy. So it's a huge amount of energy she needs to be able to put on half a body condition score if she's not there already. It's much easier to be able to put that on as a dry ewe or in that early to mid pregnancy phase than it is in that late pregnancy phase. Very rarely will you put body condition score on in that late pregnancy phase because her metabolic load for energy to meet her fetal requirements is so high. So if you've joined February, March and your ewes aren't meeting that body condition score 3, I'd readjust your rations to try and put that body condition score on now before scanning. So she's on target, ready for that late pregnancy phase. And in that early to mid pregnancy phase, if we don't start to meet those targets, then we'll impact lamb birth weight. So in those early phases of pregnancy, if she's not meeting that body condition score 3, then we can have around 0.3 to 0.5 kilo impact on lamb birth weight, or a decrease in lamb birth weight, which affects their survival rate, if we don't try and counteract that body condition score by lambing. It'll also, for those of you that are wool producers, have an impact on clean fleece weight and fibre diameter if we don't start to correct their body condition score now. It'll also cause you to feed a lot of feed in those later stages of pregnancy because you're at risk of preg tox by not meeting their energy requirement. So really important to look at your rations and balance them for their energy requirement or that extra increase in body condition score. Weaner requirements. So if we've got a 30 kilo weaner, most of you will have heavier weaners now, and we're targeting that 300 grams growth rate. They need 16 megajoules of energy and 16% protein. If you've got feedlot lambs or lambs that you want to grow faster, then upwards of 20 megajoules, depending on what weight gain you want to target, and 16% protein diet. So those young lambs are building muscle, so they need a higher protein diet. But depending on the live weight we want to achieve, they need a heap of energy. That energy level for a 40 kilo lamb is similar to what a ewe needs at the point of lambing. So a huge energy load to support a fast growth rate. For those of you with cattle, I've just taken the example of a 500 kilo cow with a 0 to 4 month calf at foot. And they need upwards of 80 megs of energy. If we look at a weaner, depending on, or a young steer or heifer, depending on what our average growth rate is and what we want to target, will determine their megajoule value. So as the example, if we had a 300 kilo steer that we wanted to grow at a kilo a day, they need around 73 megs of energy and about 14% protein. 16% protein. If we wanted a 400 kilo steer growing at 1.5 kilos a day, then they need a higher megajoule load at 140 megajoules. So that's a really energy dense diet to try and meet those higher growth rates. And a lot of feed if we're feeding 100% supplements if we don't have the pasture available. So what does that ration look like if we take a 60 kilo ewe as the example and we're feeding 100% supplementary feed at the moment? I've just taken an example of common diets that I'm seeing when we are feeding supplements out in the local area. So getting a lot of barley use, also getting equal amounts of wheat being used, and some really good cereal hay values coming through. So in this example, I've just used the previous PPS feed test just to show you what this diet would look like at a better quality cereal hay. So our 50-day pregnant 60 kilo ewe requires 10.2 megs of energy and 10% protein to support her requirement. If we took that wheaten hay as example, she needs a bit over 1 kilo of wheaten hay and around 100 grams of barley to support that 10.2 megajoule requirement. So we see there 10.2 megas of energy is what supports that diet on those current feed tests, but we're not meeting her protein requirement on that diet. So while our barley is testing at 12% and our cereal hay was testing at 8.7%, overall, that diet's only meeting 9% protein. So in this situation and where they are at 50 days pregnancy, including a urea supplement like a 10% urea block or loose lick would add around 1% protein, depending on the intake of that supplement, to the diet and be able to meet her requirements for maintenance or those early stages of pregnancy, get those rumen bugs growing and utilizing your more expensive energy sources like your cereal hays and grains. That would be a cheap way to counteract that protein deficit without having to add a legume, if you can get them, to that grain ration. And that would be costing us around 31 cents a day to feed that ewe. So depending on what ration you're using, ideally, if you haven't already, feed testing is really important, especially this year because of the finish we had at the end of last year and the feed quality increase in supplementary feed. So Rob can point you in the direction of getting feed tests, or he might even take them for you if you twist his arm. But getting that data back is really important because you can actually save money if your feeds are testing well, depending on what the nutrient value of them is. The other thing that I'm commonly seeing if we do have a bit of dry feed in the paddock is that ideally, as we know, it creates bulk in the rumen. So the higher that NDF value is, and you've heard me say this a lot, especially in summer feed talks, this creates a lot of bulk in the rumen, which drops feed intake because until that's digested in the rumen, the animal can't eat as much. And that ideally will reduce our overall megajoule and crude protein intake. So the things that I'm commonly seeing at the moment is that rations don't have enough protein in the diet, which ideally when protein is fed, that gets converted to ammonia by the rumen microbes through a series of different reactions. And in the presence of energy, the microbes use that to grow and reproduce. So they absorb that ammonia into their bodies, they're able to grow and reproduce, and then utilize our energy sources like our dry feed in the paddock, or our cereal grain or cereal hays or straws. So if we don't have protein or enough protein in the diet, we get those microbes start to die, which means we have less of them available to utilize our energy sources. So while there's a focus on meeting our energy requirement, we should have just as much focus on protein because it's the microbes that utilize those energy and convert them into usable forms, which meets our production targets. So for maintenance, ideally we want to grow microbes to utilize those that energy source. But for our young animals, we need a higher protein diet because protein is the building blocks of muscle growth. So that will impact our average daily gain and how that animal deposits carcass fat, which contributes ideally to that saleable meat product if that is the market you're in. So ways to counteract that at the moment if you don't have green feed available, and short green pick right now, depending on how much they're eating, probably isn't enough until you get a good feed wedge. You will have to add some type of additional protein to the diet. So for maintenance and that early stages of pregnancy, depending on how much extra protein you need, a 10% urea lick or block will give you 1 or 1.5% protein to your diet. If we're looking at a little bit higher protein level in the ration, a 50% protein lick can be used, but then other sources of protein, if you can get them this year, are vetches and lucerne hays, peas and beans and lupins, although they are looking scarce in our local area. Getting your silages and pasture hays feed tested to determine their protein amount is also really important. And then just to finish off with the transition to green feed, whenever that may be, hopefully it is soon with some patchy rains happening in the area. The really big risk coming out of a dry period or such a prolonged dry period is the green shoots that arise once we get a bit of moisture. And there's a lot of things that contribute and are antagonistic to each other when those green shoots start to arise. So the first big thing we see is that during the dry period, we get a lot of potassium, magnesium, and calcium concentrated at the root base of that plant. So that sits there, and in a normal plant, when the sun comes out, that would be taken up regularly, a good amount of magnesium, calcium, and potassium on average. But in a dry year, the first thing that generally gets taken up when it rains and the sun comes out is a heap of potassium. Magnesium and calcium are much slower to be taken up. And so the first thing that comes through in that leaf is a big potassium load. Our sheep and cattle can't store magnesium. They need a daily supply from their feed source. And so if the first thing they get is potassium from that juicy green leaf, that potentially, depending on how much they eat, will flood the rumen. It breaks up it and is antagonistic against magnesium in the rumen or any magnesium that's floating around there. Floods the rumen with potassium, spills over into the bloodstream, puts a big drain of magnesium on the brain, and that animal will eventually die due to that magnesium deficiency. So we see a lot of issues, especially in cattle, with grass tetany coming out of a prolonged dry period. The issue with sheep is that once we start to get that green pick, sheep will chase that nice, juicy green leaf because it's really high in sugars, in water-soluble carbohydrates. So again, it's like a lolly to them. A really big potassium load, and if they are about to lamb or lambing onto that green pick, then ideally we relax those smooth muscles. Magnesium and calcium work on strengthening the smooth muscles of the uterus. So if we're getting a lot of potassium in those diets, then potentially we're at risk of difficulty lambing if we're not supplying those as additional minerals. So really important to be aware, especially in cattle, of grass tetany, but supplying those additional minerals to ewes that are lambing or in that 6 weeks prior to lambing to strengthen their smooth muscles. So potentially it will aid in easier lambings. The other big thing we see coming out of a dry period is nitrate poisoning. So again, this short green pick or this actively growing short green feed. So the ruminant is unique in that it can break nitrates down in our feed to a degree. It converts them into nitrites. They get converted into ammonia and they use that as a source of protein. As we said before, they use ammonia, they absorb it into their body and they can grow and reproduce on that, which is a good thing. But coming out of a dry period, typically we see higher nitrate uptake by plants from the soil. So it hasn't been taken up by the plants because they haven't been growing, obviously, during that dry period. There hasn't been leaching of that soil. So we're getting a higher nitrate load being taken up when we start to get green feed. And that excess nitrate in the rumen gets converted to nitrites. That excess will eventually spill over into the bloodstream if it accumulates in too high amounts, and it can make hemoglobin or the red blood cells become methaglobin, which means that the oxygen in the blood cells is taken out and the animal basically suffocates from nitrate poisoning. It's a very quick death. So the livestock classes that are most at risk, or where we see this happen the most, is really hungry animals. So if you're letting them out of containment and they're hungry or they don't have a good fiber mat and they start to chase this green feed, that's where we see most of these or majority of these metabolic issues happen. But the other thing is a poor transition onto green feed. So where those animals are chasing that high sugar because it tastes really nice, and it's typically the bigger animals that die first because they eat the most, they tend to be more at risk of this nitrate poisoning if we haven't gradually introduced green feed to those classes of livestock. So really important, as you would gradually introduce a high starch grain like cereal grain, do the same thing with your green feed. They're also at risk of acidosis from the green feed because of the big sugar load. But all of these metabolic issues come back to either not being introduced gradually or really hungry animals coming out of containment if their rations aren't meeting their requirements. One of the other things is Phalaris toxicity. So most of you are familiar with Phalaris staggers. But there are two different types of Phalaris toxicity that generally sheep are affected by, but cattle can be affected by as well. The second one is sudden death, and there are two types of that. There's the polio sudden death. So it's polio-like symptoms. The sheep appear blind and they go blind. They'll start to wander, they'll run into fences or aimlessly wander around. That's said to be caused by peracute ammonia toxicity, but the causes of these two types of sudden death need more research. There's a few unknowns around why they happen. And the other type is cardiac, which can be caused by acute hydrocyanic acid toxicity in our phalaris, or a nitrate poisoning type of toxicity. So both those toxicities, PEM-like or the cardiac arrest type, are very sudden death types of phalaris toxicity, which can affect livestock more so with that short green pick again. Both of those will occur within sort of 12 to 48 hours of putting those animals into the paddock. So the phalaris daggers that is commonly known can occur sort of 2 to 3 months later, whereas where we're seeing this sudden death, it generally occurs within a few hours or within sort of 2 days of putting them into that paddock, and that's the difference. There's really no cure for the sudden death form. If you start to see any of those livestock classes start to die, then get them out of the paddock, but take them out gradually because we don't want to place any more stress on them. And again, it tends to occur more when animals are hungry because they go and smash that nice green pick and increase their uptake of that alkaloid or these acids or nitrate poisoning that they tend to be caused by. Or sudden introduction of stock to this lush pasture or this short green pick. So again, taking the time to gradually introduce them to that changing diet, especially if they've been on 100% supplementary feed diet. So again, it's that short green pick or that short flush of feed that they chase and they're not accustomed to, which is where we start to see these issues. And then releasing ewes or any livestock class back onto green pasture, we want to try and do it gradually. The issues with these pastures, as I've said, is they tend to be really high sugars, so really high water-soluble carbohydrates, which is like a lolly to the animal. They haven't seen green feed for a while typically, and they will go and chase that lush green feed. The thing that happens is that pick or our short flush of feed tends to be really high moisture, really high flow through rate through the rumen, which can flare up that clostridial bacteria, which causes pulpy kidney. And again, another sudden death-like symptom that we see on those heavier animals because they eat the most. So making sure your clostridial vaccination is up to date. If you're releasing ewes back out to pasture, typically they'll be in those later stages of pregnancy. So making sure that they've had their booster before they go back out onto pasture, ideally, if you can time it like that. But if not, giving them an extra pulpy kidney vaccination to reduce the risk of pulpy kidney. We see huge pulpy kidney issues with a big change in feed, like going from out of containment onto lush green feed. So making sure your vaccinations are up to date. If you can and you're feeding ewes in containment, try and get them out 50 days before, but ideally that's going to depend on what sort of pasture wedge you've built and what your lambing paddocks look like as to that decision. The biggest thing that I can stress is ensure that they have gut fill and make sure they have a good rumen full of fibre. So if you've got straw in your pens, give them a really good fill of better quality cereal hay if you've got it available. If not, make sure that they've had a really good fill of fibre, sort of 6 to 12 hours prior to release. So you slowly, once they eat that green feed, it'll be stuck in that fibre mat and it will be gradually digested. It won't have a high flow through rate through the rumen from either a hungry animal or an animal that hasn't had its uptake of their ration in containment. Ideally, release them later in the day. Ensure your animals are not hungry, which I've stressed a lot. If you can, try and introduce green feed gradually, like you would introduce a high energy grain. So putting them on there for short intervals and off, depending on mob sizes and labour. So keeping them on there for a few hours and then taking them off. Maybe you put them in a laneway, depending on your logistics and how your paddocks are set up, and keep them on cereal hay for the first week, and gradually increase the time they are on that green feed. If you can't do that, then have an adjoining paddock with poorer quality feed if possible, or just ideally, if you can't do any of those, have a better quality hay available that they're actually going to eat when they go out into this lush pasture, to create that fibre mat, to get them gradually introduced to that pasture. So the more gradual you introduce those rumen microbes to that change in feed, then the better that decrease in metabolic disease will be. Ideally, we want to provide ad-lib roughage depending on what you've got left at that time, and what the quality is. Ideally, it would be better that you could feed something they'll eat, especially in that first 2 weeks when we put them onto these lush pastures. But that will depend. Obviously, we've been feeding for a long period of time. It will depend on what's left in our hay sheds and on farm as to the quality of that forage. And then provide access to that high magnesium and calcium lick or mineral supplement. So as I said before, there's a lot of potassium uptake depending on soil profiles and so forth. But typically from a dry period, we see a lot of metabolic issues because magnesium and calcium are lower once we go back onto lush green feed. So I've looked at some of the feed quality in the local area, some of the livestock requirements for March. We've looked at a few rations and the things that I'm seeing missing in diets at the moment, and that transition onto green feed. My details are there. Again, PSA, if you haven't signed up for the drought funding in the Ararat Council area, please do so. There's one-to-one consultancy available from a range of different advisors that can help you with all things drought related. It might be formulating rations, or it might be looking at the business side of your business, but that's certainly available to you to take advantage of during this dry period. I'd like to thank PPS and AgVic for the opportunity to speak tonight. And I think we're taking questions after or at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jess. Yeah, we'll have some questions time at the end. Now I'd like to ask Cam and Grace to take the floor, please.
We'll try and keep it short, sharp, and sweet while Grace works out the technological stuff. Cam and Grace, we're at Gorst Rural, so we're a rural solutions business south of Ararat. Obviously, a lot of our focus is around pasture work, and we do a lot of trials and work. Grace has been with us 3 years. Grace has done a lot of work on the trial scene at Tattayun and Dairy, just trying to add value, get production data and see what we can do there. And Grace actually works with some of our big pasture guys, working on feed budgeting and then working on how we can grow grass. So just want to have a session really. Obviously everyone's looking for feed. We'd love to see it. So yeah, it's a bit of a need for feed, but hopefully we keep it pretty light. And if you've got any questions, yeah, obviously at the end, save up. But I'll hand it over to you, Grace. You're the guru.
Thanks, Cam. So if everyone can see that screen, all right, I'll keep going. Yeah, so as Cam mentioned, just going to quickly touch on some topics about what we want to be looking out for in our pastures coming into autumn, more from that agronomic sense, I guess. So to start with, I guess this whole sort of presentation is where to from here. As Jess touched on, like I took this photo just out my back fence, and I think it's probably what a lot of you guys are seeing at the moment as well. Our paddocks are bare. There's nothing but dust, dry pasture. You've probably been feeding stock for a long time. So I guess it's what we do with our pasture systems going forward. A really key point, which I'm not going to touch on, but I think is really important, is knowing your feed requirements. So if you can do a proper feed budget and really know how much dry matter that you're going to need for the season, and especially in those really critical times, you're joining lambing, etc., when you're going to need those peak amounts of dry matter. If you know that and you have that information present, it's really going to help to link up with what sort of species and varieties and stuff we want to be growing. But I'm mainly just going to go over assessing your pastures, so knowing trigger points, when to manipulate, oversow or resow, and then just a little bit on watching out for pests that we're seeing at the moment, and a bit on staggers and stuff that Jess has already covered, actually. But start with assessing our pastures. Important to do this as early as possible, really, just to help with the decision making. Obviously, the earlier we can make all these decisions around our pastures, the quicker we can get feed in and we can start getting things going. Obviously, right now, paddocks are pretty bare. There's not going to be much there, so we will need some rainfall just to freshen everything up and to be able to really see what our pastures are looking like coming out of a pretty tough summer and 12, 18 months realistically. But the best way to do this is really just to look at your ground coverage. So drive around in the ute. If you have a quadrant, that's great, or the pasture paramedic rulers that I think we all have somewhere. Throw that out at 8 to 10 random spots in your paddock and just visually have a look at your ground coverage. See what's there, whether it be weeds, bare ground, or the species that you've actually sown into the paddock. And then I think it's handy to have some trigger points in your mind just to make these decisions really easy. So when you're looking at ground coverage, you know at what point you want to be going in with different things. So if you're driving around, you're seeing at least, over 90% of desirable species. So the species that you've sown into that paddock, that's awesome. That's what we're aiming for. If that's the case, we just want to keep on top of our seasonal maintenance, our weeds and fertilizer. If you're looking and it's looking close to that 70 to 90%, this is where we want to probably be coming in with our more selective weed control, making sure we're keeping on top of any weeds that are really starting to pop up and keeping our fertilizer rates up so the fertility is still high. If it comes down to that 50 to 70% desirable species, certainly weed control is still going to be important, but it's probably where we're thinking about sowing more of our medium-term pasture species in there to bulk out our pastures for a couple of years before we plan to go into that full renovation phase in another 2 to 3 years. If you drop down to the 30 to 50%, this is really where you'd be thinking about putting an annual in. So just something to bulk out that pasture for one more season. So hopefully you're setting that paddock up to go into a full resow next season. If it's less than 30%, hopefully you're already going into a full renovation phase, your paddock's prepared, you've sort of already got everything ready for that. So if we're looking at pastures, it's probably important just to see or understand what a good grass and clover pasture looks like. So certainly you want, at least 90 to 95% of desirable species in there with less than 5% weeds and 5% bare ground. If this is a mixed sward, so you want at least 60 to 70% of your grass species and 20 to 30% of that legume content. If that's clover, it's obviously going to peak and trough a lot throughout the season, but as an average, at least 20%. These are just some photos I found online, but I think they're really helpful to visualize that ground coverage. It can be a little bit hard to get your head around. Everything at the moment probably looks like that 20% photo, but hopefully after we get a bit of rain and things freshen up, it's easier to visually see. And if it's still looking like that 20% ground coverage, that's probably where we're coming in and doing that full renovation phase. If it's looking more like 40 to 50%, that's where we're thinking about either an annual or a hybrid to tack into our pastures. And if it's looking more like that 80% pasture, we're just mainly manipulating the pasture species and just putting some fertility in there. So no matter what sort of going down, paddock preparation is probably the key point. A really good place to start is a soil test. So definitely want to be checking your pH, your NPKS levels, and any of those toxicities. So especially like aluminium or manganese, any of those things that are going to be really detrimental to sowing a new pasture. Also, just consider the paddock history. So when's the last time you've done lime, gyppo, dolomite, any of those things? And if you have done them in the last 12 months, we're certainly seeing a lot of soil tests come through this year where we're still picking up those amendments in the top 10 centimetres. So if you've done any lime or anything in the past 12 months, you've got a soil test this summer and your numbers look a little bit funny, that could potentially be why too, just because we haven't had the rainfall to wash those things down through our soil profile. Obviously knowing your paddock, so if they're a paddock that gets waterlogged, the soil type, all those sort of things are just going to help you pick the right species to fit into that particular paddock. If you are going more into the resowing phases, very important to make sure you've got minimal weeds, especially if you're going back into perennial pasture. We want to be starting on as clean a slate as possible. Trying to get a good knockdown on the paddock before we sow anything's really helpful. It's obviously a lot easier to control those weeds pre-sowing than it is once we have a pasture already established in there. And if you're sowing into a remnant pasture, you may need some cultivation or something just to help with your seed bed. And pretty important, watch out for plant backs. So definitely, whether that be from a knockdown spray that you've just done or broadleaf sprays that you've done in the past season, just make sure you know that your plant backs on any of those chemicals and you're well outside of that range. And a lot of plant backs will also have a rainfall range on them as well as time. So we haven't had a lot of rain over the past 12 months. So just make sure you keep an eye on that and just watch your labels with any plant backs. So if we move on to using annuals, this has definitely been a very hot topic for us the last couple of weeks, and a lot of questions we're getting from farmers is around our annuals. So it's just because they're a really great method to get that quick, easy, cheap feed in your paddocks when you need it, and they can withstand some pretty tough conditions. So, you know, whether that be that you've got a little bit of a weed burden in your paddock, we have an imperfect seed bed, we're going to see some wetting and drying of soils, all those conditions that you probably don't want to be putting your perennial pastures into, annuals can withstand that a little bit better. And to get the most out of our annuals, we definitely want to be sowing them early, just so we can get them up and away to get that early or late autumn feed, early winter feed. There's a couple of options with annuals. It could be an annual ryegrass. So certainly we've seen annual ryegrasses perform, you know, from 10 to 14 tonnes of dry matter per hectare throughout multiple seasons. If you're putting this into a paddock where you know you've got a bit of a background of broadleaf weeds, you could just go straight annual ryegrass, and it's a really good chance to clean up your broadleaf weeds in that year. Or you could mix it with a clover. Cereals also an option, so whether that be a wheat, barley, oats. The grazing varieties of all these cereals are really great, but if you're just looking to get early, cheap, easy feed, I would just go with whatever variety you have on hand. So if you've got something in the silos, grab a seed test off it, just make sure you're checking germination on it, and get that in early. It's certainly probably going to benefit you more than waiting to buy a grazing variety. You do have better herbicide options in your cereals too, so another thing to be mindful of if you're looking to clean up a paddock a little bit. Annual clover is an option as well. Obviously going to be your highest quality feed and really good to clean up grass weeds, but more of a spring dominant feed, so probably not going to be your go-to if you're needing something quite quickly. So just around sowing annuals, you can see there's a couple of dot points there around soil temperature ranges and what we see with germination with ryegrass. So certainly we're aiming for a soil temperature of around 15 to 20 degrees. And in that, you should be seeing at least 90% germination of your ryegrass within, 3 days. If we go a little bit too early and soil temperatures are too warm, this is where we can see a pretty dramatic decrease in germination rates. And if we leave it a little bit late and things cool down too much, you'll see that germination period really stretch out, so take quite a while, and you'll start to see plants fall off as well. If you're taking soil temperatures, just try and take it around 9 o'clock in the morning. That's sort of your standardized time before the sun heats up the top layer of the soil too much, and just do it a couple of days so you get an average reading of it. But realistically, we want to be sowing these annuals before the soil temperature drops below 10 degrees, but also trying to avoid daytime air temperatures above 30 degrees. So if we've got little ryegrass trying to germinate and get up and away and we get quite a warm day, that is going to knock around your plants a little bit. So it's a little bit of a tricky time to be sowing things now because we need those soil temperatures to be right, but we also need air temperatures to be right as well. But I think we're past all of the really hot days, potentially. On the right there, you'll see just a little bit of data from our Derrinallum pasture trial. So this is just our annuals from 2024. And the main thing with that is you'll see even in a season like last year where we got, really minimal rainfall for this high rainfall zone, we're still seeing those annuals perform, up to 8 tonnes of dry matter, which is pretty significant in that system. With the annuals, there's not a whole lot of difference in dry matter production between varieties, but it's more about just picking the variety based on your environment and what sort of suits the area that you're farming in. So if we move on to short-term ryegrasses, so short-term or hybrid ryegrasses, the terms sort of used interchangeably a bit, but they're a cross between an annual and a perennial ryegrass, and the persistence of the species really depends on the percentage of perenniality. So if you have a variety that's 75% perennial, it's going to last closer to that 3 to 4 year range. Whereas if you've got a variety that's a 50% annual, 50% perennial, that's where you're going to see probably that 2 year life out of it. But as I said, it can last anywhere from 2 to 4 years generally. And because of this, we see it fit really well into cropping rotations. So if you're on a mixed farm, you're wanting to pull a paddock out of crop for a couple of years, short-term ryegrass is a really great option. You get the most dry matter that you can over those couple of years, and then by the time you're ready to go back into crop, the pasture's ready to be sprayed out and you're ready to go again. We see a pretty similar growth curve in these to the annuals. So good autumn and winter growth with the hybrids as well. And they make a really good oversowing option for that, bulking out your pastures for a couple of years before you come back in with a perennial. So again, some data there from our dairy site in 2023. I just thought I'd show some more data on what you'd see in, I guess, an average year. But again, you know, anywhere from 7 to 8 tonnes of dry matter throughout the season for these varieties. And again, important to pick your variety based on your environment, so heading date, and also how long you want it to persist for. I think this photo sort of demonstrates what I was just talking about really well. So this is that trial site that the data is pulled off. This is the hybrids going at the end of their second year, going into their third year. And you can really visually see there the varieties that have more annual background. The plots are really starting to thin. There's pretty low plant numbers there. And the ones that have more of that perennial background, there's still a really thick plant density there. They look ready to go for another season. So that sort of goes on oversowing. So as we mentioned before, sort of want to be picking your grass species for oversowing based on how long until you want to come back and fully renovate that pasture. So whether that be an annual because you're planning to re-sow next season, or that more medium-term option in the hybrid ryegrass. If you are sowing into a residual pasture, using a disc machine will certainly cause the least disturbance to existing pastures. But if you have a tine, will also work really well. You just got to remember to back off the speed and go quite slow just to cause the least disturbance possible. And if you're working with a seeder that is more set up for cropping, so it's got wider spacings on it, you could try sowing in a diamond pattern. So sow diagonally across the paddock one way and then come back the other way. And that will just reduce your spacings a little bit. If you're looking at your pastures and you're really happy with the grass density, but your clover's lacking a little bit, certainly we can come back in and just top up that clover a bit as well. So if we move on to manipulating our perennial pastures, fertilizer is probably a pretty good place to start. As we said before, checking your rates against a soil test is probably your best bet, just to make sure you're not over-capitalising or under-capitalising on anything. I think we all know how important P is in our pasture system. So as a rule of thumb, you need at least 1 kilo of P per hectare, per DSE, per year, just for maintenance. If you're needing a capital application, that's on top of your maintenance. With nitrogen, I know some people are pretty wary about using urea on their pastures, but definitely a strategic use of urea can really help increase your dry matter production, especially coming into those periods where you know you need that peak amount of feed. Obviously, you do have to watch for your withholding periods for nitrate poisoning. So we recommend at least 2 to 3 weeks with stock off the paddock. Sort of depends on conditions a little bit. Just enough time for that plant to grow out and dilute out the nitrates in the leaf. K is obviously quite important, especially in systems where you're cutting a lot of hay or silage. And don't forget about those traces. So moly, boron, copper. They're all really important, especially if you've got clover in your system. You'll see quite an increase in dry matter when all of these levels are up to scratch. A single super MOP blend is a pretty good place to start for your pastures. So it sort of covers all your bases fertility-wise. And yeah, that's a good blend to start off. If we move on to weed control, certainly targeting your weeds when they're small, young is going to be your best bet. You'll get a better kill. You can use lower doses, lower rates, all those sort of things. If we are doing any broadleaf sprays, definitely want to make sure your clover is at least 3 trifoliate, so 3 true leaves, before we do any broadleaf sprays, just to make sure we damage that clover as least as possible. You will slow up growth no matter what sort of brew you do, but the amount will depend on how strong a brew that you need to go with. And there's different sprays that we're probably targeting at different points in the season. So whether that's a spray on the break, like a gramoxone simazine, to get your barley grasses, silver grasses while they're still young, or that could be a mid-season spray with a Raptor, Shogun, your broadleaf sprays, to try and target more fog grass, brome grass, onion grass, your broadleaf weeds. Or it could be coming back at the end of season with your gramoxones or your glides, for your hay, freeze and pasture topping sprays, to get those summer weeds. Definitely probably want to be doing this strategically, so don't go across and spray your whole farm with gramoxone simazine because you're going to really knock out your feed base. So just targeting the paddocks where we know that we've got these weeds present and mixing up what times of the year that you're doing your sprays, so you've still got enough paddocks to graze, while you have to keep stock off those ones. So if we move through to resowing perennial pastures, as I mentioned at the start, prep is really important for this. We don't want to be making a decision on the spot. It's definitely a decision that hopefully you've thought about for a couple of seasons and you're coming into it with a really good fertility base, paddocks clean, everything's ready to go, to set that perennial up for the best it can. I think it's helpful to think about taking the paddock out of rotation for a year. So certainly depending what species you grow, you will get some grazing off it, but it might only be 1 or 2. So if you have in your head that the paddock's out of rotation for a year, we can set that pasture up the best we can to prolong its dry matter production. Obviously, fitting what pasture type into your system is important as well. So if you're looking for a really long-term pasture, you might go for a phalaris. We know that it's slower to establish, but once it is up and running, it gives you really high dry matter production, and it can fit in quite well if you've got heavier soils. Perennial ryegrass, if you're looking for something more that 5+ year range, maybe you're in a higher rainfall, and you want some better quality feed, perennial ryegrass is probably your go-to. You definitely want to be picking your heading date to suit your environment. So the earlier the heading date, the more suited it will be to the northern regions with a drier, hotter finish to the season. The later heading dates are going to be more suited to your southern regions where you get a softer finish, a little bit more rain in spring and summer. Your cocksfoots and your fescues also have a place in certain soil conditions. So certainly cocksfoots fit well if you've got quite acidic soil, or fescues in areas that get waterlogged or maybe you have high salt. Personally, I think if you can grow a phalaris or a perennial ryegrass, that's going to be your best bet. But your cocksfoots and your fescues definitely have a place in the system as well. Just the last couple of things on pests. So we're seeing a fair bit of crickets out and about around our area at the moment, and they definitely can do a lot of damage to your pasture persistence. So the easiest way to get on top of them is to bait. You just want to go out there after you've spread the bait before you're going to put sheep or livestock back in the paddock, and make sure there's not too much grain on the ground, just that those livestock can pick up. But generally we'll say it's about a 14-day withholding period on that. Red-leggeds are going to start to become more active as temperatures cool down as well. Probably not seeing them as an issue right now, but as our nighttime temperatures start to drop down, we'll start to see them become active again as well. Slugs and snails are probably a big one. We sort of forgot about them the last 12 months just because they weren't very active, but definitely if you're sowing a new pasture, it's worth putting a bait out. Slugs can do a lot of damage even overnight to a new pasture, so a bait is a really cheap and easy method just to protect yourself when you're trying to get that pasture up and germinating. So last slide, just on some watch outs going on to autumn feed. I think Jess sort of covered most of this already, so I won't go over it too much, but we know that staggers is always an issue at this time of year. whether that be Phalaris staggers. We want to make sure that we're not putting stock on the paddock before it's at that 4-leaf growth stage, and cobalt can be a quick fix for this as well. So you only need 100 grams to 1/3 of your paddock, whether that be every third spray line or however you wanted to do it, can be a good safety net against Phalaris staggers. Whether ryegrass is more of your issue, you want to be making sure that the plant is at least 3-leaf growth stage before we're putting stock on that paddock, and using a lower endophyte ryegrass can help with that as well. Of course, if you're unsure, use sacrifice mobs before you're putting your whole mob of sheep or cattle out there. And if, as Jess said, if you're going out of containment onto fresh feed, make sure stock are going out with a full stomach and plenty of forage on hand as well. We always see a couple of nitrate issues at this time of year as well, and we've seen a couple of cases of preg tox and hypocalcemia as well, so just some ones to watch out for. But that's all I've really got. Certainly my number's down there, so is Cam's. If you have any questions or you want us to come out and have a look and help with some of these decisions, I know there's a lot happening at this time of year, and you guys have a lot of decisions to make. We're happy to help you guys with that, so feel free to give me a call or drop into any of the stores. I don't know whether you have anything.
No, done well, Grace.
Well done. Thank you, Grace and Cam. Does anybody have any questions? You can either put in the chat or ask a question just using the video.
I've got one that was sent in, Sinead, from Adam Stevens, which I'll ask in a minute to Grace and Cam. But just one bit on Jess's talk. PBS got a hay corer now, works off electric drill. Just give me a ring and arrange to pick it up. If you want to get a feed test done, I can send it away and bill you for it, or just send it to feed test. But anyway, we've got a corer for loan. Adam wanted to just get an idea on what you might do with containment areas or sacrifice paddocks that are pretty bare to get some cover back, but also utilise the extra nitrogen that's probably in there for a bit of quick feed. Any comments on that?
For me, it's getting ground cover as quick as possible, using the nitrates as quick as possible. For me, it's probably what do you want to do long term. First one, I'd be looking at cereals in the shed. You know, what have you got in there that you can quickly jam in there that's going to give you some quick feed? You know, whether it's oats, wheat, barley, what have you got there that you can jam in quickly? It's not going to be long-term feed, but it's going to give you quick grazing. It's going to use the nitrates, you know, and put it into bulk really quickly. Second option, if you want something a little bit longer going into spring, I'd be looking at something like an annual ryegrass that's going to give you really quick feed. You know, these are cheaper options. 15 kilos of an annual ryegrass is really going to soak up some nitrogen really quickly and push feed right into spring. So 2 scenarios there for me. It's either a quick growing cereal or a quick growing annual ryegrass. The cereal would then lend itself if you want to put something in the spring, so forage rape or a lucerne or a chicory plantain or something like that. That's probably what it sets itself up for. It's not going to give you spring feed, but it's going to give you quick early feed.
No, I'll pass that on, and good advice. Yeah, just thank everyone for the talk. It's been excellent, and especially the animal health issues. As I said when we started, I've just been impressed the way people got their stock through so far. There's still a way to go, and there's some really good messages from both talks tonight, so that's great. Well, quiet. Any more questions? Don't know what happened to Sinead there, but is there anyone got any more questions? I reckon everything's been covered really well. So, did you want to see if there's any more questions, Sinead?
There's no questions coming in the comments. Does anybody else have any more questions for any of the presenters today? People do, they can always email them through to me or Rob, and I'm sure we can find out the answers for them as well if people want to sit on the information for a while and have a think.
Absolutely. And I think I remember doing one of those talks a couple of years ago, and I was talking to John Sweeney the next day, and he said there was no questions. It was one of Jess's talks, and I said, well, did we need any? And he said, well, I guess we didn't. I reckon I reckon we've got to that stage with both the talks tonight. They've been absolutely brilliant. So that's great. So this, as I said, this will be recorded. We get a lot of people that are planning to watch it afterwards as they're feeding sheep and everything. So that'll be out ASAP, and I'll get it out to our members, and also I'll get it to you, Cam, so you can use it however you want.
I've had a question come in from Craig Altman. Grace and Cam, does it need to be either or? How about multi-species?
Yeah, I guess I don't know, Craig. What sort of angle you're thinking of there? I think.
Oh, look at that! It comes off mute. Sorry, mate. I thought it had been set on mute by Sinead. Yeah. No, I was just listening there, and your comments are spot on. And I thought, does it need to be an either-or situation with cereals or ryegrass or clover, brassica, whatever else you might want to chuck in to that mix? I know it's common enough to mix things together. So just there might be a reason though that you're suggesting to go either cereal or ryegrass rather than mix the two together.
Oh, look, I think it just depends on your scenario, really, Craig.
Yeah,
so
cool.
Either I and or it doesn't really bother me. A lot of guys are going for that cereal / ryegrass for hay production to try and get the best of both worlds. I just think sometimes we get trying to be too fancy. In my book, when you're trying to get quick feed, let's go for the quick feed first, and maybe we do some of the multi-species stuff where we've got a little bit more time to let some of those species come through and shine. But that's me. But I don't think it needs to be either or. It depends on your situation. I guess.
Yeah, cool. No. Thank you.
Good question, Craig. Thank you for that.
Pleasure.
Quick on either Jess or Grace and Cam. Just given that we've everything's been pretty utilised very well this year on our grass base, we're probably leading into a pretty heavy clover dominant setup for winter. Are there anything we should be looking out for on a livestock point of view or just grazing point of view? As I said, on livestock or pasture management, just setting up into the winter period.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's brilliant for clover because we've got bare paddocks that clover burr's going to love. One would hope that maybe this year, if you think dryland sub can set 300 kilos of sub, it probably didn't do it last year, but the stuff from the year before and the year before, there should be a power of sub there. I think it probably just comes down to assessing those paddocks, seeing what's there. It may mean that you do more of a grass oversow than a full-blown reno. I think it's probably assessing each paddock and seeing how they're going. Obviously, you will know a bit in your own mind how bad it is for barley grass and stuff like that. That's probably the worry with, a really clover dominant paddock that's going to have a lot of nitrogen is probably going to have a lot of barley grass. So, some of that barley grass will be handy first up, but some of it will be better sown to a ryegrass oversow to compete with it. So just assessing that and then seeing where it's at. I think is invaluable. There's something else that I've completely wiped my mind.
Old clovers.
Yeah, some of the older clovers, obviously, some of those estrogenic clovers probably need to be a little bit careful of and see how they go. And the other one, obviously, is clover's going to take a fair time to get established. We do have a few guys now going out with like the water cart and just wetting up, a couple of square metres inside the gate or in a couple of areas, a couple of times a week, just to try and see what perennials are going to come back, what we've got green shoots on, what the clover set is like. And look, if you've got the time and you really want to study it, it's probably not a bad idea, considering how crap the summer's been, to wet up a little area and just see. I think we'll be surprised how much of our good deep-rooted perennials come back, is my honest opinion. I think that's probably another exercise. Did I answer the question, Lockie, or did I just go off on a tangent again?
No, that's interesting. I mean, we've all got a few leaky troughs kicking around that are helping us make those decisions too. But and just on a livestock health side of things, Jess, so we just obviously getting some roughage out there early on.
Yeah, so clover's typically super high in water-soluble carbs. An 80 to 100% monoculture is never a good idea. Always see a lot of bloating issues, especially if they haven't had access to high sugar feeds like that for a while. So you can get acidosis issue, but also a bloating issue. It depends on what fibre you've got available. So they're not going to want to eat straw or low sugar cereal hay. So better quality hay, especially in that first 2 weeks of introduction, to try and get that fibre mat happening and slow down the digestion of clover.
Does it matter if it's high protein going on to that high protein green feed?
On paper, yes, but if it's only for 2 weeks to get them adjusted to that paddock and they're going to eat it, then I think a high protein pasture hay or like a lucerne or a vetch to get that fibre mat into them is better than something that they won't eat and having bloating and acidosis issues. Clover is typically high calcium, so just having a good high magnesium lick out there too.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions or comments? No, none that I can see. Again, I'd just like to thank Jess and Grace and Cam. I think both presentations are absolutely fantastic. I think they've given us a lot to think about going into this next season, whatever it might bring. And yeah, if you've got any questions, just feel free to shoot them through, and hopefully we get some of this rain soon.
Well, good. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Well done,
Yes.
Jess. And Grace and Cam and Sinead. Brilliant.
Thank you.
We'll see you all sometime.
We will. Yeah.
Bye.
All right.